everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are in session with Pierre Paslier, the co-founder and CEO of Notpla, a company at the forefront of sustainable innovation, transforming the packaging industry with seaweed-based solutions. With a background as an engineer and former innovation designer at L'Oreal, Pierre has seamlessly combined technical expertise with a bold vision for a waste-free future. Under his leadership, Notpla has won global accolades, including the Earthshot Prize, and continues to challenge the dominance of single-use plastics with scalable, groundbreaking alternatives. Pierre, we are thrilled to have you join us here about your journey, Notpla's mission, and the future of sustainability in packaging. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So talking about not plastic, in other words, Notpla, when you were a child growing up, did you ever think seaweed was going to be the all-encompassing part of your life?
Absolutely not. I don't think that many children would dream of kind of like working in seaweed, but I think they should. There's so much opportunities, but I think at that point I was just really intrigued in how things worked. But I did want to become an inventor, and I was always kind of like playing with Legos and just really wanting to kind of like build things my way and understand how we could make things better. So that's been something that's been with me for a long time.
So what was your pathway to creating Notpla? A little bit, if you can share with us your background.
I actually studied engineering at an engineering school in France. And then I started working as a plastics packaging engineer. And those things, they get made in the hundreds of millions. So it's really interesting as a grad job, but also quickly you realize that you're producing a lot of plastic. And that plastic is unfortunately a material that doesn't go away. It's a material that is quite alien, that has only been on this planet for 150 years. And so I started to feel quite bad about all this pollution that I was responsible for through my engineering. And so after a few years, I decided to quit my job to come and study a master's at Imperial College and Royal College of Art in London, thinking that this was leaving my packaging career behind me and I was moving on to new things. But I met my co-founder, Rodrigo, who at that point had previously trained as an architect, but was also interested in taking a different turn on his career. And together in our kitchen, we started looking at slightly kind of like weird brief. We wanted to create something that would feel a bit more like a fruit type of packaging than an industrial container made from synthetic materials. We really wanted to create packaging that feels more like you could pick it from a tree. That's something that would actually come out of a factory.
But why seaweed? Because of all, you're using a resource that in and of itself, isn't it have a finite end to it as well?
We actually found out about seaweed because we were really intrigued by another technology that uses seaweed, which is how fake caviar is made. So if you've ever had those like fake little fish eggs, those are actually an invention from Unilever from the 90s for making this alternative to the real caviar. And that was really the starting point for us. When we realized that this was made from seaweed, we're like, wow, what if you could make this material bigger, thicker, more resistant, create like encapsulation for a larger dose of water, juice, cocktails, anything. And that's when we realized that seaweed was actually an incredible resource. Before that, all I knew was that seaweed was a smelly thing when you go on holiday vacations. But as actually when we read into seaweed, we saw that some species can grow up to 1 meter per day. So it's one of the fastest growing organisms on the planet. Not only that, but it doesn't require fresh water or fertilizer. It doesn't compete with land for growing food. It's truly a regenerative organism. And so it felt like there was a big reason to use that instead of petroleum. So we were sold.
So it's regenerative, but is there a point where that could be a risk as well as a source?
So we actually asked ourselves this question quite early on, because when we were in our kitchen cooking up those kind of like big fake caviar bubbles filled with water that literally were edible. So it was quite a crazy concept of edible packaging. We thought if that was really taking on and if that was becoming mainstream, are we just about to create the next environmental disaster? Are we just kind of like taking something from nature that's not going to scale? And so that's when we run the numbers. And actually, hypothetically, if Notpla was applicable to every single-use plastic in the world, and we were replacing all of that plastic with our seaweed material, we would only need to farm 0.06% of the ocean to create all of that material. And so that really shows that seaweed is incredible in terms of how renewable and scalable it is.
And so is seaweed one of those type of ingredients or products that is already in use in other areas and industries that we just, maybe the common person doesn't know about?
Yeah, I mean, like that's the crazy thing. We assumed that it was just used for this fake caviar application. But actually, as we reached out to some of the people who were manufacturing those extracts of seaweed for kind of like those applications, we realized that it was in all sorts of everyday products. It's in your ketchup, it's in your toothpaste, it's in your pet food, it's even in beer, like the head of the beer, like for the foam not to collapse too quickly, there's a little bit of seaweed in there. So the world uses 40 million tons of seaweed for all of these applications. People don't realize, but we're really not starting from scratch.
So then you're creating a product that is quite groundbreaking, but yet you've got this entire industry of plastics. Are they knocking at your door? Are you getting a lot of friction there because you're encountering a group that I'm sure has a lot of lobbying power too?
It's a bit of a love-hate relationship. I'm not going to lie. There's a lot of people who have a vested interest in the current solutions. I mean, we just had recently a failed attempt by the UN at a global plastics treaty, mostly because there's lots of people who have a lot to lose at kind of like controlling plastics in a more kind of like strict way. That being said, there was like an inability to reach a consensus by the United Nations to actually create a treaty around like how we use plastic and how we try to curb the amount of plastic that enters nature. And there was mostly because the strong kind of like lobbies of a lot of the petrol producers in the world and like the plastic producers who felt that this was going to have an impact on their pockets. So obviously there's a lot of people who have kind of like a lot of skin in the game. At the same time, I feel like now plastics is very well understood by the general population to be a problem that we need to solve. We can't keep on pumping plastic in the ocean and eventually in our own food and now in our own bodies. The impact that it's having from a health perspective, from a climate change perspective, this is very clear that we have to find better ways. And I think that we've also reached the limits of recycling and all of the solutions that enable the plastics industry to continue operating business as usual. So there's a big role that we need to kind of like give to alternatives. And I think that seaweed has a big role to play. And I think some people are starting to see that in the industry.
So then in essence, do you think the recycling is not enough? The plastic recycling, it's not a solution? Let's
put it this way. I think we have a moral obligation to recycle as much of the plastic that we have created, because otherwise, what are we going to do? Is it going to solve the problem? Absolutely not. Today, after 50 years of investing hundreds of billions into the recycling industry, we are at 7-8% of plastics recycled. So the system does not work. And recycling only allows the narrative of plastics to continue unchanged. What we need is to prevent plastic from entering nature. And to do this, you need to either use materials that are already present in nature, like seaweed or cellulose from trees or other materials that don't create harm for nature, or you need to have incredible control over the materials that you use. So reuse is a great model as long as you have less than 10% loss of your kind of like plastics, because otherwise it's even worse than like single-use plastics in the first place. So I think we're going to need application per application to look at what is the right solution and make sure that we are picking the right one, because reuse in the wrong place or seaweed in the wrong place are not going to enable us to stop using plastic.
So then do you think the solution, in addition to doing what you're doing, would that be the single-handed answer, or do you have to collaborate with the people that you're trying to say no to?
We've been working on this for now like almost 10 years. We have now reached the point of replacing millions, tens of millions of single-use plastic. So it's exciting, but it's a drop in the ocean of what the plastics industry is producing. So we need to collaborate. We need more transparency. We need people to come together. We actually have created an industry group for other nature-based solutions that are using the natural materials of the environment, from mushroom to shrimp shells to coffee ground. And we've called this the Natural Polymers Group. We're all competitors, but we need to bring this group together, to grow together, because we are a new industry that hopefully is going to create that alternative to plastic.
Well, the strength in the numbers there. So what about when it comes to government regulation or governments looking to alternative solutions? Are they on your side? Are you working with them, or how does that help?
There's been like an incredible amount of legislations in the pipeline in all around the world trying to tackle this plastics problem. And some of them are really highlighting the level of the problem that we have. So one particular one I would love to kind of like dive in really quick is what happened in the Netherlands. Last year, they introduced a tax on takeaway food containers that contain plastic as a coating. And when they introduced this, they found themselves in a unique position where for the first time, a European government, had to know who to collect the tax from if they contain plastic and who was exempt from paying the tax if they didn't have plastic. And they realized that they could not take at face value the marketing claims of all those solutions because everyone was claiming to be plastic-free, plant-based, etc. So they said
all the different manufacturers of products.
Exactly.
With products. Okay.
Because claims are very easy to put on the market, and up until now there was not too much enforcement. And so they put together a group of experts, material scientists, academics to actually answer the question, which one of those products contain plastic? They took samples from the market, sent it to the labs, get some kind of like reports on all of this. And the shocking kind of like realization that they came to is that they only found one solution on the market that did not contain plastic. That was Notpla. Everything else that they looked at contained plastic, whether it was like plastic polymer from petroleum or chemical modified natural resource like corn that is turned into PLA for making a bioplastic. But every single product that they tried to kind of like put in the machine gave the answer plastic. And all of those solutions were claiming to be plastic-free, plant-based, biodegradable. So it really shows that until you have a little bit of kind of like enforcement on the market, the industry is not going to self-regulate at all. And the problem is that it creates zero incentive for innovators to actually do the job. Why would we bother spending millions of pounds and like putting teams of tens of PhDs and scientists to crack it if everyone is able to sell their plastic with a little bit of good branding for the exact same claims? So since then, there is a lot more kind of like demand for what we do because there's a clear separation between the people who are claiming to be plastic free and weren't and the ones that actually kind of like meet that standard.
So I can see the necessity of meeting that standard, but when you think about, you've discovered what the problem is or some of the hidden factors, but the why would someone want to be like that?
Yeah, I think like some of the barriers is that those are relatively kind of like commoditized markets where it's hard to justify to innovate when you can just get away with whatever you've been selling before. So I think the incentives were not so aligned for innovation to come up naturally. And I think also there's been a lot of people who had like a lot of incentives to continue to use their equipment, their kind of like existing factories, their existing like production lines. So one of the things that we've had to do is to actually develop our materials to be as drop-in as possible to remove any friction from the industry to adopt those new materials like seaweed. So recently we've really kind of like managed to make our materials run through plastic lines, just the same way those plastic polymers would be loaded onto those machines. You can load the Notpla seaweed pellets and it actually flows. And I think that is one of the steps that we really need to completely validate to have that frictionless switchover of one material to another. I think the price
and it becomes more seamless, right? If they can use some of their existing infrastructure and transfer.
And I think that was one of the requirements that like obviously required a lot of like time on those lines and a lot of kind of like R&D efforts. I think price is interesting because price is purely like driven by volumes and the economies of scale. I have zero doubt that our seaweed materials are going to be cheaper than the other kind of like materials that claim to be plastic free on the market. And what's really interesting is that when you think of plastic, there's this false narrative that plastic is cheap, but actually plastic is not a cheap material. It's just heavily subsidized by all the countries of the world that are trying to pump out these things as quickly as possible, by the energy industry, But when you look at some analysis that has been done by Deloitte and WWF and a number of kind of like experts on the topic, plastic is probably 100 times more kind of like expensive to society than the price it's being traded at. So all of that cost is left to future generations to deal with because no one is really taking into account those externalities. And I think it's time we start understanding that things have a cost for the future of like humanity and this planet, and try to bring that into the P&L today rather than just leaving it for the future. And then we'll make much better choices in terms of materials.
So that is probably one of your bigger friction points, is the financial aspect of it then, because I'm sure people can logically see that the seaweed is much more sustainable than the plastic for the environment, for everybody. So is that your biggest friction point then?
It has been in the past. I think what's been super exciting in the last year is that actually it is a flywheel. And so we've had some early adopters, for example, Levy, who operate like hundreds of stadiums around the world for like food service. They made a switch to Notpla because that was aligning with their objectives to eliminate plastic from their operations. And through that, we've been able to pull millions and millions of units of burger boxes and hot dog trays and all sorts of kind of like other types of items. And we've been going back to our value chain to renegotiate the unit economics. And we've been able to bring down the cost by significant amount this year, next year, the one after. And so now we are really finding ourselves at pretty much like the same price as some of the other so-called sustainable solutions in the market that are already trading in the billions of units. So we've done the hardest part of the journey.
Yeah. And the client is seeing the benefit as well. So what if, for example, you go to an event, you get a hot dog tray, whatnot. What do you do with that tray after? Do you throw it in a particular kind of trash, or does it go to the regular landfill?
So that's what's amazing about it, is that most packaging today has one suggested end of life, which is quite good. And every other end of life is full of problems. Usually like you need to get it right, or you get it very wrong. And what's really great about Notpla is that we are kind of guilt-free. Any of the end of life is never going to create forever waste. So there's a few things that you can do to create even more value. If you take that hot dog tray and you put it in recycling, there'll be the ability to get those fibers back, and then you can sell those and you're creating value out of the waste, which is great. Or if you put it in compost, you'll be able to get valuable compost that you can sell, and that's also creating value. But even if worst case scenario, it just goes to kind of like general waste, you've already saved that little bit of plastic that would have otherwise been made and coated onto this product. And therefore, you're not creating this forever waste. And in some cases, it's actually incredible. Like some of the entertainment venues that we work with, they have on-site wormeries in the basement. So they have giant tanks with like soil and worms. All of the food waste is actually like treated on-site, 0 mile of transport of their waste with the packaging. And then they're actually creating soil that they can use to kind of like create a wider like range of parks and kind of like greenery around their venue. So lots of like really exciting opportunities, because when you work with natural materials, you can do all of these things.
And so these are some entertainment venues in Europe, or?
Yeah. So today we are mostly operating in the UK and Europe. So we're active in 10 countries through kind of like our work with stadiums. We're now adopted by 50 stadiums across kind of like Europe. That's your Wimbledon strawberry and cream box that was made by Notpla this year. In terms of like the football, soccer, we have kind of like the Chelsea, Tottenham Hotspurs, number of kind of like teams across the country. Lots of rugby games at Twickenham, cricket at the Oval, concerts at the O2. All of those are really kind of like amazing venues that have made a step towards like eliminating plastic in their operations. And so it's really sending that signal in that industry that things are like possible to do without the plastic. And now we are actually like getting the first US venues with the Portland Trailblazers at the NBA kind of like stadium, who are starting to use Notpla, showing that it's happening in the US as well.
Wow. So that's a really great way to reach hundreds of thousands of people repeatedly through these venues. So what are some of the other applications of seaweed apart from takeaway food packaging? How else is Notpla using it?
So one of the things we are very excited about is the ability to create more rigid applications. So in the takeaway food containers, we're mostly looking at applying a coating that is grease-proof and waterproof at the surface of those containers without the plastic.
Mm-hmm.
That's a flexible application that is kind of like stuck on the cardboard. We've been able to work with a grade of seaweed that we can injection mold into cutlery so that we can actually create more rigid applications. And again, for food service, there's a lot of cutlery used that is kind of like single use that is going to be kind of like thrown away after 5, 10, 50 minutes. And so that is a really good use of seaweed in our eyes. Also looking at flexible films, especially for little dose of detergents and other products that are kind of like pre-portioned that like are going to be used for your dishwasher or whatever it is. So that's we're seeing a lot of kind of like interesting use case, especially for dry food. So we're starting to package actually like a single dose of noodles or kind of like for beverages, coffee. And the magic thing is you can make this film soluble. So actually when you throw it in boiling water, it dissolves and it releases its content. So you can imagine for like noodles, you could just throw your kind of like noodles with the pack directly into your boiling water in your pot and everything is kind of like edible, no waste. So there's lots of interesting things we can do with seaweed that you can't really do with plastic.
And what about, I was reading about the pod things, or is it like a little self-contained energy food source? What is that?
So that's probably the most kind of like eye-catchy products of all. When we started in the kitchen, we really had this idea of creating edible packaging, something that would really feel like fruit. And so we found a really good application of that technology for marathons, where if you've been to a marathon, there's piles and piles of plastic bottles, plastic cups. Everyone is consuming this in great quantities for such a short amount of time. So it feels like it's really like a missed opportunity to use something as natural as seaweed. And so we partnered up with like one of the leading energy gel producer who is typically using the sachets made of plastic and aluminum for containing those energy gels. And
Right.
we filled our little pods with those. And that creates an actual kind of like edible shot of energy that you can eat as a whole. A bit like if you imagine a cherry tomato filled with liquid energy gel that you could literally like pop as you're kind of like running your best time ever. So that's what we are bringing to the market next year. And we're already doing that in a lot of events, but that's going to hit the shelves of supermarkets next year.
So how though, if they're self-encased and you can eat it, are there any naysayers out there like, well, but I'm eating something that's got dirt on the outside if I stick it in my pocket? How do you deal with the packaging outside of that?
What's really interesting again is if you take it as a new format, it can be a little bit unsettling to think that you would eat packaging. Whereas if you bring it back in the world of fruits or vegetables, that is something that we are kind of like doing all the time. That is actually kind of like working since 100 million years, where we've really got like a comparable that like makes a lot of sense. So we always try to take this analogy of fruits because that's really what we're trying to achieve. So when we've tried now probably like over 1 million of those kind of like pods with races and runners, the moment that they are kind of like seeing that it's just like a grape or like a cherry tomato in terms of like the concept of it, they're actually like getting on with it very easily. Because we are producing specifically for those events, we're actually like able to deliver like with all of the hygiene requirements and even better that you would imagine compared to, for example, a can that you're literally putting your lips to when it's been through 10
True.
warehouses and all sorts of kind of like different steps. We actually have something that is a lot safer than that. So that's a bit the approach.
Okay. So I'm curious, when you've referenced a few times that when we're in the kitchen, is this literally a kitchen or is it a kitchen of like an idea lab?
So we actually we didn't have access to labs when we started with my co-founder. So we literally started in our student kitchen. Mm-hmm. And that's where the magic happened. That's where we kind of like discovered how we could create those like fake caviar little kind of bubbles. And what was wonderful about this is that because we had to cook the next meal in our kitchen, there was no way we could introduce something that was toxic or dangerous. And so that safeguarded us from ever using something that would compromise the value of our product. And to this day, we've kept the same approach. So we have now much fancier labs that we had in our kitchen back in the day. But those labs, they are food labs. So you're not able to handle something that would be toxic that typically you would find in the labs of a big chemical company that makes a lot of those plastics. And because we are unable to deal with those more toxic and dangerous materials, we'll never be able to integrate them slowly in our formulations.
So is the product that you create or in the food lab, everything is 100% natural? There's no insertion of any chemicals or anything like that?
So the goal is to do no chemistry whatsoever. Mm-hmm. We don't want to create new molecular. We only want to work with the ones that are already present in nature. It's very kind of like contrarian for chemists, but actually nature has already created all of the molecules that are incredibly kind of like functional and useful. And because those already exist for such a long time, wherever they end up, they never create a problem in nature. So our role is more to understand and to select and to purify those kind of like molecules from the natural environment. But we don't build anything from monomers and from scratch. We don't modify anything. We just keep it the way nature built it.
So how do you deal then with, if there's multiple people out there who want to have a sustainable future and you must have some competition at some point, how do you compete friendly?
That's a good question. I think we're here to build an industry. We're not here to kind of like be the only solution in town. Obviously, we have come up with challenges that we've got the chance to solve first. And that's resulted in us kind of like being able to patent a lot of that technology. And there is a lot of things we need to do that are quite kind of like protective of our technology. But we're also here to say we need a diversity of solutions. We want to have a number of those natural polymers that are kind of like hitting the market. So when we kind of like realized that there was going to be some of those legislations coming in that were going to be supportive of what we do, we created the Natural Polymers Group, a representation of some of those innovators in the market that are looking at some of these other types of natural resources, but always with this same philosophy of not chemically modifying them, just using them the way they are. And I think that's where
shrimp shells, right? And any other shells or something. Share with me a little bit about how some other products could have uses like that too.
I mean, when we look around us, everything is built with some of the like natural materials that have been evolved around like 100 million years to 1 billion years of kind of like evolution of nature. And those are incredibly elegant solutions to all of those problems. And so it's about time we start looking at nature for picking those solutions rather than trying to create our own from scratch. And so when you look at nature, there's lots of things that are behaving in a slightly plastic way. If you've ever picked up seaweed on the beach, it actually feels a bit like a plastic bag or a plastic film. So there's something in there that is interesting to that application. That's why we got started with seaweed. But if you look at like shrimp shells, they also feel like they are a little bit plasticky. They are made of certain polysaccharides that have those properties that are really interesting. And it goes on for so many other materials, from like the foaminess of mushrooms or kind of like some of the like protective layers of corn. All of these things are really interesting materials that nature has developed. And so there's a growing number, like probably in like the tens of startups that are looking at cracking each one of these things by respecting nature and just using it the way it already exists. And that's what this Natural Polymers Group is all about. It's saying, let's embrace the diversity of nature. We have a vested interest in seaweed, but like seaweed is not going to do everything. There's some things that mushrooms are going to be much better at, and some things that shrimp shells are going to be much better at. And so we want to create the right applications.
Yeah, I mean, I even know that salmon skin is used as a material, a textile, an alternative textile. What else had I recently come across? Human hair. I think there's some lab or a group in Holland that was using excess human hair as a fiber as well for clothing. So it's quite fascinating.
Honestly, we are at the beginning of this journey, so we don't have many applications available at scale. But I fully believe that in a matter of like 2, 3, 4 years, there's going to be so many solutions that actually are now fully scaled up with cost that is kind of like competitive and like an ability to work anywhere in the world, because even if you lose those things, you never push nature beyond what it's been dealing with for 100 million years. And so it's just kind of like a small period of time of about 200 years where we thought we could just get away with creating synthetic materials for everything and anything. And I think it's about time we recognize that we can't create that and lose it all around in nature without some serious consequences.
Well, talking about the creation of plastics, within this 200-year time frame, you were telling us that near Notpla headquarters was the creation of plastic. Share with us what that's about.
So it's actually a funny story. Like, I wish we knew that before we moved where we are, but the Notpla is located in East London in a neighborhood called Hackneywick. Little we knew that that literally plastic was invented 300 meters away from where we are today. So there's a plaque on the wall that says plastic in the world, Alexander Parks, 1866. And basically this gentleman invented the first plastic. And what was so interesting about this is that some of these first applications of plastic, the material was so unstable and unrefined that literally some of those applications, they would be extremely flammable, or for some of them even exploding, sometimes spontaneously, because the materials was still at the beginning of the R&D cycle. And so, funnily enough, there's very few samples left of that plastic invented by Alexander Parks, because most of them has caught on fire in the basement of museums who collected them and now have kind of like burnt boxes in their basement.
But talk about coming full circle, being 300 meters away from where plastic was invented. And I think now you need to put a plaque on your building's wall where the seaweed...
But you wouldn't believe, literally a couple of weeks ago, we had the deputy mayor for the environment of London coming to visit us, and I've asked for that plaque, so it's been made as we speak.
Oh, we'll have to get a shot of that, an image of that later. I love that. So when you wake up now, you probably have a different perspective in life when you think... you said you were working on plastics with L'Oreal and now seaweed. So you sleep better at night. You have a whole different perspective on life.
There's something that actually I'm taking from the Earthshot Prize. Prince William and the Earthshot Prize have this phrase of being urgent optimists. And I think there is that resonates with me, that there is a lot of reason to think that we're going to come up with those innovative solutions that actually enable us to live sustainably without pushing the earth beyond what it can handle. But equally, we're really running out of time. And so I think we have a duty to accelerate this as much as possible, because we can't pollute much longer before those effects are disproportionately worse. And so, yeah, I'm an urgent optimist. I think there are so many tens of thousands of people working on incredible solutions all around the world that haven't scaled yet, that are just about to deliver their impact. So that's reason for optimism. But equally, we are not moving faster. I was let's come back to the Global Plastics Treaty, that the world would fail to recognize that we need to have an ambitious plan to tackle the plastic pollution problem seems crazy. And history will judge us on that we failed to come together with a plan. Same with climate change. So I think we really have no time to lose. And that's a bit my I think what keeps me up at night, even if I'm obviously very excited about what we're developing.
Sure. And that's an important aspect to share with everybody, because retaining or maintaining that optimism when you're in the thick of seeing how much needs to be changed. I mean, you see probably more than the average person of, wow, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of plastic out there. There's a lot of challenges and scaling new solutions. So maintaining that optimism in a world that can give us anxiety, that's quite a great thing. So how would you tell maybe a new person who's trying to scale up, how do you maintain that optimism?
I think humans have a hard time compounding the effect of time on taking things to great heights. I think that when people started with solar panels 50 years ago, they would have never dreamt that this very expensive technology would now be able to produce electricity at a cheaper rate than a coal plant. That's True. Incredible in terms of achievement. We've done it because there's been generations of people working on taking it to the next level. So that's the power of humans. And one thing that gives me actually a lot of perspective is let's go back to Alexander Parks, the inventor of plastic. It turns out that he kept notebooks of his early years of like discovering plastic and then kind of like starting to manufacture it. And I got a chance to kind of like read some of those notes. And in one of them, he describes how he's obviously very excited about the waterproofing properties of some of those new kind of like plastics that he's created. But he's writing to himself that he doesn't believe that this is really going to scale because the technology is too unstable and it's always going to be too expensive to make this material. And like there are competing technologies that are going to be better. So he's basically saying, I wish there was like an easier path, but it looks like it's not going to work out. And he couldn't be more wrong. Like plastic literally took over the world. He just couldn't see beyond a certain point. So I think that the same goes with nature-based solutions. We see it as like the first generation, the second generation of these things, and it feels like it's not really going to compete with petrochemical solutions, or it's not going to compete with whatever else. But the reality is, once we give them a chance to grow, we could go so much further than our wildest dreams. So that's often how the human brain is limiting itself.
So keeping faith and the optimism, working on it. I mean, yeah, that's a wonderful example of how Alexander Parks thought before. And now look at, if you could see the world today, right?
Yeah.
We just need to do that with alternative solutions. So let's wrap this up with one thought of what do you think it will take to make sustainable packaging and application uses the default, not the exception?
Honestly, I think one thing that is common to all of the best partnerships we've done with lots of companies, from kind of like those energy gels to the stadiums, delivery companies, it always comes to one person on that organization who decides to be an internal champion for that idea. And that person has an incredible power of navigating an organization that for a startup is very hard to kind of like understand. And they have the power of kind of like just pushing all of those kind of like obstacles away. And I think that power actually is incredibly easy to yield for anyone who is working in those big corporations that are producing all of these things that we use day to day. Like anyone who is kind of like in a position to be able to leverage those kind of like corporations can become one of those champions. So I don't believe that what we need is like big legislations or that we need some cataclysm events or something like this. I think we just need a new wave of internal champions that are realizing that within their organization, they can make a difference. They can pick up one innovation and make it a reality. If 1% of people who listen to this podcast will kind of like think of what they can do personally to help that next generation of solutions come to scale, that could be transformational.
Very well said. I really appreciate this whole conversation about Notpla, where you're taking it with sustainable resources, and fascinating to hear that you're collaborating with people with alternative natural polymers, as you say. So thank you so much for joining us here at In Sessions With, and this will definitely be inspiring for everybody listening to it. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you so much.